This is CNN.
In New York, a verdict in the John Gotti murder and racketeering trial.
I haven't heard as much shooting.
We don't have to worry about bullets going through our windows.
To me, it seemed like a prison.
Gates and guards, Los Angeles communities doing whatever it takes to keep gangs and drug dealers away from children.
Party convention.
And Jerry Brown's flat tax proposal. Can it work? Who would it help? Who would it hurt? We'll hear from experts on both sides of that issue. Welcome to Newsday. I'm Lou Waters. Cheryl Atkinson has the day off. Reputed mob boss John Gotti, guilty on all counts. The decision came down a little over 30 minutes ago. A New York jury found him guilty of 5 murders and murder conspiracy, 11 counts of racketeering, gambling, loan sharking, and obstruction of justice. The man once known as the Teflon Don now faces life in prison. The 7-man, 5-woman jury deliberated just a day and a half before reaching the verdict. CNN's Charles Feldman has been covering the trial and has a look back now at the events leading up to this guilty verdict.
Some have called it the mob trial of all mob trials. The U.S. government versus John Gotti, reputed godfather of the nation's largest and most powerful mafia family, the Gambinos. It came complete with one of the most dramatic courtroom confrontations in memory, the testimony of Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano, who turned against his former friend and alleged mob boss by becoming a government witness. The key charge against Gotti: he was the mastermind of the 1985 rub-out of mob boss Paul Castellano. Gotti associates, like these gentlemen who came to court day in and day out, now call Gravano Sammy the Rat. That's because he broke the mafia's strict code of silence, testifying he and Gotti actually sat in a parked car on the night of the Castellano murder, prepared to be backup shooters. While Gravano was on the stand, tension was high. The courthouse had to be evacuated when someone phoned in a bomb threat. 2 other bomb threats followed. And this trial showed that the Gotti clan, if nothing else, is media savvy. A parade of stars, invited by friends of John Gotti, came to pay their respects. Movie star Mickey Rourke, TV star John Amos, recording star Jay Black of the 60s group Jay and the Americans, and Anthony Quinn, who blasted Gravano for being what he called a snitch.
I was raised on the east side myself in Los Angeles, and that was the worst sin one could report.
Although the government called 37 witnesses in the 29 days of trial that followed opening arguments, prosecutors relied heavily on some 8 hours of secretly recorded FBI tapes of Gotti's own voice, a voice the government said that can be heard ordering a murder. As the trial wore on, tempers flared and exploded. The judge threatened to remove Gotti from the courtroom after Gotti blew a sarcastic kiss at the prosecutor. And a lawyer for Gotti co-defendant Frank Locascio was held in contempt of court after he got into a shouting match with the judge. Like all good dramas, this one had a subtext: fear. It drove the judge to keep the jury anonymous and sequestered. It was expressed by some nervous witnesses, and it undoubtedly played a contributing role in the jurors' deliberation. Charles Feldman, CNN, New York.
Charles Feldman has been in and out of the courthouse and will be back with us shortly with a live update on this John Gotti verdict and the ramifications of it. A Senate subcommittee is wrestling with the issue of warning labels for alcohol advertising. Supporters of warning labels.
All today on CNN.
The attorney for one of 4 police officers accused in the beating of motorist Rodney King says his client will not testify in his own defense. CNN's Greg Lamont is covering that police beating trial and joins us now from Simi Valley, California with the latest. Greg.
Well, in somewhat of a surprise, former LAPD officer Timothy Wynn will not take the stand in his own defense. His name was on today's witness list, but his attorney told the courtroom he will not appear. There are 2 initial theories as to why. One, that Wynn wanted no part of prosecutor Terry White after watching him go through Officer Lawrence Powell like a buzzsaw after 2 days on the stand. The other theory is that the prosecution really didn't put on much of a case against Wynn, other than the videotape in which Wynn is seen in it hitting Rodney King several times with his baton toward the end of the incident. In fact, his name has rarely been mentioned throughout this trial. And Wynn's defense has always been that since he was the rookie on the scene, that he was just doing what he was told by his superior officers. There has been no jury in the courtroom this morning. Wynn's attorney is trying to get introduced into evidence Rodney King's criminal record. Rodney King is an armed robbery parolee, and the defense feels that was motive enough for him to initially flee police in his car, and then possibly again after he was stopped.
He had a motive to escape. He's a parolee. He knows he's going back to the joint if he gets caught with marijuana and alcohol in his blood and racing down the streets and conducting this chase and jumping up and attacking an officer. He's got an intent and a plan, which is to try to somehow madly overcome this environment, get away, suppress these officers, get loose into Hanson Dam Park. He's not making a mistake. He's not an innocent victim. He's not just this innocent, unarmed motorist that's beaten up by this gang of black shirts.
That's part of the danger of what this evidence is, since he was not an innocent person, so to speak, because he's committed crimes in the past or suspected of committing crimes in the past, that the police had a right to deal with him differently than they would deal with anyone else, just because of his past character and behavior, even though that character and behavior was unknown to the police.
Well, the judge also said his concern was that to allow Rodney King's record into the courtroom would allow the prosecution to use the records of the police officers against them. Officer Lawrence Powell also faces excessive force charges brought on by a Latino. That was prior to the Rodney King incident. Greg Lamont, CNN Live, Simi Valley, California.
All right, Greg, we'll keep tabs on that trial out there. While we have the opportunity, and in the crush of reporters outside the Brooklyn courthouse, where almost an hour ago now John Gotti was found guilty, we have the opportunity to check in with Charles Feldman for the latest. Charles.
Yes, Lou, a crush of reporters is right. What we're all doing here in front of Brooklyn Federal Court is we're awaiting the arrival of the three defense attorneys, the defense attorney for John Gotti and the two defense attorneys for his co-defendant, Frank Locascio. They're inside this courthouse now talking to print reporters, and they say that they will be out momentarily to talk with all of us, and when that happens, we will present that to you live. To recap, of course, the verdict, the Teflon Don, no longer the Teflon Don. John Gotti convicted of everything from racketeering and murder to obstruction of justice and all the way down to income tax evasion, the very thing that the government finally got Al Capone on many decades ago. His co-defendant, Frank Locascio, who has been described as the counselor and before that the acting underboss of the Gambino crime family that this jury found John Gotti was boss of, was found guilty of similar charges but found not guilty of one single count of gambling in the state of New York. However, both men, both John Gotti and Frank Locascio, will now go to prison for life. So when the defense attorneys come out to talk with us, we will present that to you. Till then, Charles Feldman, CNN, reporting live from Brooklyn Federal Court.
Okay, Charles, we'll be back to you. Next on Newsday, politics. Hecklers hassle Jerry Brown over his potential choice for vice president, and we'll be debating the merits or demerits of Brown's flat tax plan.
The Bond Committee, and I believe it.
With the New York primary only 5 days off, the Democratic presidential candidates are concentrating today on the Big Apple. Governor Bill Clinton spent part of his day shaking hands with diners at a Brooklyn restaurant. Jerry Brown encountered hecklers while speaking to a Jewish Community Relations Council. Brown was badgered for naming Jesse Jackson as a possible running mate. In his 1984 bid for the White House, Jackson offended some Jews with what were interpreted as anti-Semitic remarks. Jerry Brown also is taking some heat from Congress over his flat tax proposal. Today, Democratic Senator Lloyd Benson, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, said the Brown plan might well have been designed by the sheriff of Nottingham. Benson claims the plan would reduce taxes on corporations and the rich and raise taxes for everybody else. Brown proposes a flat 13% tax to replace the Social Security and personal income tax everyone would pay, and the only deductions would be for mortgage, interest, rent, and charitable contributions. Corporations would pay a 13% so-called value-added tax. Critics say that would be passed on to the consumer and, in effect, be a hidden sales tax. Among the critics, the Citizens for Tax Justice, one of its members recently called the plan stupid. Joining us on Newsday is the Director of Tax Policy for that group, Michael Ettlinger, and William Niskanen, Chairman of the Cato Institute, is with us. He was acting Chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors during the Reagan administration. Mr. Ettlinger, let's start with you and gang up on the Brown proposal. What's stupid about simplifying the tax code, eliminating all the deductions and junking the federal income tax, the corporate income tax, Social Security tax, the gas tax? What's stupid about that?
Well, what's stupid about it is that it's an enormous tax cut for the wealthy. It's an tax increase for low and middle income families, and it raises the budget deficit by about $200 billion. And it's not really much, a flat tax is not really simpler. If you think about it, most people who file taxes now, when they get down to their taxable income, they just look that up in a table, and that tells them how much tax they owe. Multiplying your taxable income by 0.13 instead of looking it up in a table is not particularly simpler.
Well, we have now a statement, I understand, sent to the Citizens for Tax Justice from the Brown campaign saying, quote, taxpayers at all income levels pay less in federal income tax under the flat tax than under the existing system. Is the campaign lying? Is Jerry Brown lying?
Well, let me address, first of all, we haven't seen it if he sent it to us, but people would, if you take the combined personal income tax and Social Security tax and just look at the 13% flat income tax, sure, that's going to be less. The income tax is going to be less, but you have to add in the effects of the value-added tax, because the 13% income tax only raises about half as much revenue as the current personal income tax plus Social Security taxes raise, and they're making up for it, at least partially, with the value-added tax. And the incidence of the value-added tax is very regressive and hits low and middle income people very heavily.
Let's get Mr. Niskanen in on this. You say it's pro-growth, anti-government, but isn't it strange that you should be supporting a Jerry Brown idea?
No one has ever charged Jerry Brown with understanding what he's saying. He's sufficiently erratic that he's bound to say something right, and I think in this case he's hit on a gold mine. A flat tax would significantly increase total output and income in the United States through 4 or 5 different processes. People would pay lower marginal rates on additional earnings from either labor or capital. The double taxation of corporate earnings would be eliminated, significantly reducing the cost of capital in the United States and increasing investment. The tax bias in favor of debt financing would be eliminated. A well-designed flat tax proposal could be much simpler than the current proposal, and it need not hurt the poor. Now, some of the specifics of the Brown proposal are ones that I think should be changed, and my understanding is that Brown's prepared to back away on almost any detail.
I understand that's correct.
But the general idea that he is promoting, I think, is a very useful contribution to the policy debate. It's refreshing to find, almost for the first time, a genuine idea in this campaign.
How would you modify this idea to eliminate the charges that this is a regressive proposal?
The most obvious way to do it is to provide a large exemption for a family. The best design of the flat tax proposals was that proposed a decade ago by Professor Hall of Stanford University. In that proposal, he would have a $16,000 exemption for a family, and then a flat marginal rate of 19% on all remaining income, without the complication, and I think a wholly unnecessary complication, of an additional value-added tax. That would eliminate the poor from the federal income tax system. There is no way to have a flat tax, however, that generates the same revenue as our current system without increasing the proportion of the taxes paid by the middle class. Now, whether it increases the absolute taxes by the middle class depends very much on the resulting economic growth.
Mr. Ettlinger, would you go along with that?
Well, I agree that the middle class is going to see a tax increase if this plan is ever adopted, and that it would under any flat tax proposal. As far as all the talk of this great economic growth we're going to get from something like this, it's the same old supply-side rhetoric we've heard since the late 70s particularly. And what did supply-side economics get us in the late 70s and early 80s and on? Well, it got us huge tax cuts for the rich. It got us large income increases for the rich. And middle and low income people have seen their income stagnate or drop. We've got $2 trillion more of debt, $400 billion this year. I don't think that this supply-side growth argument has been borne out in reality.
Mr. Niskanen?
Well, Michael is misrepresenting the facts. The total output per adult increased substantially in the Reagan years.
But who got it?
Total productivity growth increased very rapidly relative to that in the Ford and Carter years. And by and large, the promise of the supply-side economists was borne out. What the flat tax proposal would do would be to pursue the general direction of the Tax Reform Act of 1986, but just set the stake out there that much further. And I'm perplexed by those who have supported the Tax Reform Act of 1986.
Excuse me, gentlemen, I'm going to have to interrupt. Thank you both for joining us. We're going to have to cut away and go on up to Brooklyn, where the defense in the John Gotti trial is about to give its reaction to the guilty verdicts we heard about an hour ago. John Gotti guilty on all counts.
Everybody ready?
Yeah.
Mr. Krieger, your reaction to the conviction verdict against your client, Mr. Gotti?
Extreme disappointment. A growing respect for my client, who has conducted himself on receiving this rather shocking news who has conducted himself upon receiving this kind of shocking news with enormous dignity and what would be another word, John?
With courage.
Courage.
He took it like a real man. And he has vowed that the fight is not over, ladies and gentlemen, and it's not. I warrant you.
Well, are you disappointed, Mr. Krieger, that the jury was not out very long? Does that suggest to you that they just didn't buy the defense argument for 1 minute?
Well, I guess one must conclude that, of course. But you're talking about matters which are extremely personal in the sense. What difference does it make to us whether the jury is out 1 hour or 1 week or 1 month if the verdict is a bad one? And we feel that this verdict was a bad one, Charles, and that it, unfortunately, in our opinion, and I think I say this on behalf of the three of us, that the jury did not give adequate consideration to the defense arguments, did not give, more than that, adequate consideration to the evidence and to the applicable law.
Well, are you planning to appeal this? What grounds are you planning to appeal this on?
The judge didn't allow you to put on a proper case?
There are many grounds that we plan to appeal, and without cataloging them, I can tell you this, that we are all confident, and as John Mitchell said, that when it became clear to us that if the jury was coming in this quick, it was probably not good news. What John told us all and Frank told us all was not, they were consoling us, as opposed to feeling sorry for themselves, saying that this fight will continue and eventually we'll win it. We believe there are sufficient reasons to overturn this conviction.
What are some of those reasons?
I'm not going to detail at this point the various grounds on which an appeal will be based any more than I will detail the grounds that we will include in our Rule 29C, which will be filed within 30 days from now. But we are dissatisfied to our bones with the verdict, and we will not hesitate to pursue every remedy available to us.
Well, there are a number of things that we wish that the jury had been aware of, and perhaps the visceral reaction that led to this conviction would have been different had we been able to present what we believe to be appropriate evidence that would have had significant impact on some key portions of the government's case, including particularly the credibility of Gravano, including particularly the credibility and accuracy, if you will, of the government's tapes and transcripts, and including particularly, probably most particularly, the credibility of Sammy Gravano.
Mr. Cardinale, Mr. Krieger said that he spoke for all three of you, and he said that he didn't think the jury gave enough time or deliberation to the evidence, but doesn't that fly in the face of the fact that in regards to your client, Mr. Locascio, they were very specific in finding him not guilty of 1 count?
Well, that's the part that we can't understand because it really doesn't make sense. In the course of the RICO conviction, what they did was they found him guilty of that as a predicate act in the RICO and then somehow found him not guilty on the substantive count. It's inconsistent, but it demonstrates to us the fact that they really didn't, unfortunately, give it enough attention or test the case sufficiently. I mean, it just doesn't make sense that they found him not guilty of the substantive count. And they should have.
Mr. Krieger, you said that you have a growing respect for your clients.
Some local cable operators will be cutting away for a commercial message at this time. CNN live coverage of the Gotti case continues.
In my respect for him and an unfounded jury verdict.
Do you think the jury believes Sam Gravano? Do you think the jury believes Sam Gravano? Closer to the mic.
I'm inclined to think that they must have accepted Sam Gravano's testimony. And maybe it's because I'm too objective and analytical in my view of the evidence, and I do not give enough credit to the jury in reaching its verdict based upon a bias or a prejudice or a perception of wrongdoing as opposed to that which was demonstrated in the courtroom. I stand by that which we urged upon the jury. For example, that the description of the Castellano homicide as given by Gravano is a fiction and was disproved time and again during our presentation of the defense. Now, why the jury concluded the way that it did can either be laid on the doorstep of we lawyers in not establishing something in defense, or, and this is the theory to which we subscribe, that the built-in perception of wrongdoing...
For those viewers rejoining us following a local commercial break, CNN is bringing you live coverage of defense reaction to the guilty verdicts in the John Gotti trial in Brooklyn, New York.
Seek to fight uphill against uncharged crimes that consisted of a myriad of murders of which the grand jury did not indict. Number two, jury tampering, which is literally throwing a snake into the jury box. We had to deal with all of the various allegations of Gravano. And I tell you, not one of us as defense lawyers were aware of the scope of Gravano's testimony until a day and a half before he got on the witness stand.
If you want to know really where we're going to go on appeal, following up on what Mr. Krieger said, obviously this verdict is not an analytical verdict. This is a verdict What plugs into that kind of an emotional response are all of the problems that Mr. Krieger has brought before you. This was an uphill battle to try and prevent perceptions of wrongdoing in this case. We had to fight constantly against the admission of uncharged crimes. We fought desperately to try and give a view of these defendants that was fair and balanced. We had a difficult time, and sometimes it was impossible to get evidence before the jury which would show the other side of these people. Now, if the issues that are ultimately going to be raised on appeal, the most forceful ones, are going to deal with the admission of these uncharged crimes, with the ability of the government to be able to try and put evidence before the jury, to make arguments to this jury, to taint them, to taint their view and prejudice their view against these gentlemen as a whole, to prevent them from doing what was necessary, and that was to analytically look at the government's proof and see whether or not it was there, to overcome the more emotional arguments and to go really to the meat of what was there, or in this case, what wasn't there.
Just to follow up,
Give me more of an idea.
just to follow up and give you an example of what we're talking about here. And I think I couldn't say it any better than John, but let me just say this. At the beginning of this case, Andy Maloney got up and gave an argument to this jury that they should decide the case not based on any emotion, not based on any fear, not based on any prejudice, but on the evidence. The end of the case, given the production that I suggest went into this to taint the jurors and to make them make a decision not based on any analysis, but rather on gut emotion, you saw what this case was all about when Maloney got back up and told this jury, basically, forget about the evidence, forget about analyzing it, convict because you should be afraid, convict because you should have prejudice, convict because these are bad men, not because we've proven it. And what he did in that type of argument was take away everything we tried to do in the course of the case, and that was to have the jurors have enough courage to test the case and to analyze it, because if they had done that fairly and without prejudice and without fear, they wouldn't have come to these verdicts.
Mr. Krieger, in all the years that you have been a defense attorney, which are numerous, have you seen a case quite like this? And if not, what makes this particularly novel?
No, I have not seen a case quite like this. And that begins with the jury itself, the sequestered anonymous jury. Secondly, with the price paid by the government for Gravano's testimony. I said it in the court, I say it here. Our country is sick to the core if it is willing to pay for testimony by literally absolving a person of 19 confessed murders. You heard the argument that he's going to do 20 years. I warned you. I'd like to have as many good years left as the number he will do less than 20 years. Oh, absolute control of himself, supportive of each one of us. You have three lawyers here who are relatively passionate people. And we were hurt and stunned by the verdict. And our support came from John Gotti and Frank LoCascio, each of whom, in relative selflessness and admirable selflessness, sought to give us consolation.
Absolutely. They were more concerned with consoling us than feeling sorry for themselves. There's never been any of that. They don't see this fight as over. It's not over. We're going to appeal these decisions. We're going to hope to get another opportunity to get before a pettit jury and try this case again, and hopefully on a more balanced setting. You can do nothing but praise the amount of pluckiness and the amount of courage and dignity that these defendants had in this defeat.
Do you think the judge, gentlemen, gave you a fair fight?
Oh, we can't comment on the specific activities of court, prosecution, except in the areas in which we have met it on the public record. If we have any complaints about the court's conduct of the trial, well, there are appropriate forum in which we should raise that. And it is quite possible that some of the issues that we will raise at a later time will involve decisions made by Judge Glasser, but we really don't want to go beyond that.
Do you think that the fact that you could not bring in your witnesses had a lot to do with these convictions?
We believe it.
We believe so. We believe that had we been able to present that type of evidence, the jury would have had a far different view of what this case was all about. And we think that we were wronged in our inability to do that. And again, that's what appeals are for. And the one thing I can tell you about these gentlemen, too, is as they consoled us, was that they're realistic enough and experienced enough to know that this fight is, as they said, far from over. That we will continue and we'll be successful at another level.
Mr. Krieger, do we understand you correctly to say that Gravano just got up there and outright lied?
In many respects, absolutely, unquestionably. And I look forward to the day when we can convince a pettit jury of that. A wrong was done here.
What is the very next step, and when does that happen?
File our motion pursuant to Rule 29C, which has to be in
within
30 days.
Are you gentlemen going to be handling the appeal?
We haven't talked about that with the clients as yet.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
The defense team in the John Gotti trial for Gotti and one of his lieutenants convicted of murder and racketeering, income tax evasion, and other. Bottom line for the defense, it was a tainted jury. It was an emotional verdict based on fear. We'll take a break. More on the Gotti story and other news when we come back.
Hello, I'm Donna Kelly. Coming up on the International Hour, we'll have the latest from the United Nations, where the Security Council is now holding an emergency session to discuss today's attacks in Tripoli on the embassies of countries that voted for sanctions against Libya. We'll see you at the top of the hour. Lou?
Okay, Donna. In an emergency session today, the United Nations Security Council lodged a sharp protest against Libya. Now, that action followed violent protests in Tripoli against proposed UN sanctions against Libya. Demonstrators attacked and tried to torch the embassies of the 10 nations that voted in favor of sanctions against Libya for its refusal to turn over suspects in the Pan Am Flight 103 bombing. The Security Council is drafting a presidential statement condemning the Libyan action. The Libyan leader, Gaddafi, reportedly has put police on full alert and has appealed for calm. Congressman John Bryant, a Texas Democrat, is calling on House Speaker Thomas Foley to step aside. In a speech on the House floor, Bryant attacked his fellow Democrat, saying Foley, quote, refuses to be a political leader, end quote. But Bryant did not specifically mention the check bouncing scandal in the House. Earlier this week, Foley said he has no intention of stepping down this year. The shuttle Atlantis landed safely by the light of dawn at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida today. The 7 astronauts on board spent more than a week in orbit studying the atmosphere. The new head of NASA, Daniel Golden, was among those greeting the crew. On the ground, Golden said he was teary-eyed, calling the landing an emotional experience. We'll be back with more of Newsday after a short break.